Welcome to Green and Red, Scrappy Politics for Scrappy People, a regular podcast on radical environmental and anti-capitalist politics, brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
Welcome to the Silky Smooth Sounds of the Green and Red podcast. I'm your co-host, Scott Parkin, in Berkeley, California. Bob is off on holiday, but will be rejoining us soon. Today, we're going to be talking about the United Nations climate talks, which just happened in the United Arab Emirates. Also, it's called the COP. It's called COP 28. We're going to be talking about how the word fossil fuels was added, but it obviously doesn't go far enough. The final text actually failed to explicitly call for a phase out of fossil fuels, which was language that had been sought by over 100 countries. But we'll talk about how this affects what's going on in the global south, how the climate movement has been pushing for this for a long time, and everything and talk about what potentially could happen going forward. To have this conversation with me today is Tina Gerhardt, who is an environmental journalist who covers the UN climate change negotiations, climate change, sea level rise, with a focus on environmental justice. Her writing has been published in Grist, The Guardian, The Nation, Orion, and Sierra Magazine, and actually has two articles that came out for COP28 in The Nation and Sierra Magazine that we'll be discussing. She's the author of Sea Change, An Atlas of Islands and a Rising Ocean, and you can find more of her work at Tina Gerhardt, EJ, on Twitter, and we'll also be sharing that information in the show notes. Tina, welcome to the Green and Red podcast.
Oh, it's so great to join you today, Scott. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah. And so maybe we can actually just start off with what happened at the UN Climate Summit. Maybe just talk a little bit about the significance of the agreement and what was important and what came out of it and what wasn't included. And we'll just go from there.
Sounds great. Yeah. I think one of the things that came out of this year's UN climate negotiations, COP28, is the fact that the word fossil fuels was included for the first time. Some people have touted that as historic. It is. It's never happened in the 30-year history of these UN negotiations taking place since 1992 in Rio de Janeiro. Other nations, rightly, in my modest opinion, humble opinion, criticized the fact that there were absolutely no steps for how to phase out fossil fuels. In fact, like the very language of phasing out fossil fuels, which over 140 nations were calling for, was not included. Initially, it was included like it was last year, but then it was changed to a phase down, and eventually this kind of language was not included. So those would be the upsides and the downsides. There's a lot of climate negotiations are weird because of what people have come to refer to as UN speak, which is that they use a lot of weird language. Just to, at the beginning, to say that, in case listeners aren't familiar, why are they called COPs? It's short for, to not confuse them with police. COP stands for Conference of the Parties. Party shouldn't have us thinking party like it's 1999 or something like that. It refers to UN members, and there's almost 200. There's about 194 to 198. I can't use the word nation state to refer to them because they include things like the EU, which is not a nation, or Palestine is also included, but also not a nation. So that's the weird lingo there. And we've had 28 of them to date.
And one of the key passages of the deal, speaking of weird UN speak, says transitioning away from fossil fuels and energy systems in a just, orderly, and equitable manner, accelerating action in this critical decade was to achieve net zero by 2050 in keeping with the science. And as we're diving into this a little bit, what exactly do they mean by that? That does definitely, I would call it lawyer speak or policy speak.
Yeah, one of the things that they are talking about is this just an orderly transition. That's important. This kind of language refers to ensuring equity between nations. That also sounds like lawyer speak. So to unpack that and to translate, it basically, a lot of the UN climate negotiations, and people criticize them all the time because they haven't achieved more, and ask me questions like, why is it, should we even go? Should we even have them? Is a question that came up this year. I would say first, before unpacking that statement, that I always argue that it's important to keep the UN climate negotiations going. Are there all sorts of reasons to criticize them? Yeah, and I'm sure we'll do that over the course of our conversation. It is the only time in the entire year, it's the only multilateral forum through which countries from around the world gather with a focus on addressing the climate crisis. So that full stop is really important. It's also the only time in the year, because they take place over 2 weeks, it's a protracted, it's not like a one-off like Earth Day, it's a protracted meeting. It's the only time in the year where we have that kind of a focus on the climate crisis. There's all sorts of, from print to television to radio, there's all sorts of media coverage that we could question whether or not that attention will be given to the climate crisis if this didn't take place. And then there's the fact that when you have almost 200 members gather, that the nations that are most responsible, the global north, the colonizers, and then the entities that grew out of that early European colonization, by which I mean specifically Australia, Canada, and the US, these nations are historically responsible for the climate crisis, disproportionately impacting nations in the global south. The nations in the global south, the frontline communities that are most impacted, radically outnumber the nations that are responsible in this forum. And I'm not so naive as to think that capitalism doesn't exist and that we're like living in an equitable society, or that things are taking place, these negotiations are taking place in a level playing field. But just if you look at that numbers game and every single nation weighs in, it's a consensus decision-making process, right? Every single nation gets to weigh in on whatever's being negotiated. That numbers game has an effect, even if it's far too slow, even if there's no legally binding agreement coming out, and even if I think it's totally annoying and unfair and unjust that nations that are most impacted are not the ones that created the climate crisis and have to do all of this work, which is political, logistical, legal, economic, and emotional, all these different kinds of labor to advocate for their countries getting what they need. To come back to the sentence, that would be my opening statement on the UN climate negotiations and why they're useful and not so useful. But to come back to your statement, one of the things that these negotiations were aiming for is to ensure this kind of just transition, but they're not demanding a phase out of fossil fuels, which there's a group called the the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty is what it's called. And it has more and more nations signing on every single year. I think they have over a dozen nations now. They also have subnational entities like states, cities can sign on. Over 1,000 Nobel laureates have signed on. So there's a growing push for the phase out of fossil fuels. I've been asked to predict what the issues are going to be for next year, COP29, on different radio shows, or also for the pieces that you mentioned that I wrote coming out of COP28. And I fully expect 2 issues are going to keep being the center of attention: a phase out of fossil fuels, and I think that's going to be relentless until we get it, firstly, and secondly, getting funding from the global north to the global south to deal with the impacts of the climate crisis.
Loss and damages. That was discussed a lot in Egypt last year, correct?
Yeah, loss and damage. So last year, the big news coming out of COP27 in Egypt is that for the first time in the history of, so you see this kind of first time in the history of coming up right now after 30 years, a lot in these negotiations. So last year, for the first time in the history of the negotiations, and the history is important there because this had been argued for since the very first climate summit in Rio in 1992. Loss and damage was included in the agreement. What is loss and damage? It asks, it's global nations in the global north, frontline communities, asking for nations in the global north to recognize their historic responsibility in creating the climate crisis by being emitters, and the kinds of things that are lost, meaning irrevocably lost, or that are damaged, meaning, as the word suggests, that they've been damaged, but not irrevocably. And there's compensation that's being demanded for that. Really great that it was included last year, but all of the details about the loss and damage facility, as it was called in
Mhm.
human language. What is that facility? All of the details and nuts and bolts of, is this going to be multilateral? Is it going to work through the World Bank, through multilateral banks? Is it going to work through nation states? Like, how is this system going to work? Is it going to be in the form of loans? Is it going to be in the form of outright monies that are allocated but that are not loans? All of that was kicked down the road to be figured out at another time. So you're seeing already in the short time that you and I've been in conversation, a couple of patterns emerging. Historic when language is included, loss and damage last year, fossil fuels this year, super problematic when the details are left to be figured out.
And are they having side conferences, talks about just to talk about loss and damages, for example? Are they meeting on this? Are they trying to decide what the process will be to send funds to global South countries? Or is it just they're just kicking the can down the road and not doing anything to move this process along?
It's a great question. The annual UN climate negotiations are not the only meeting that takes place through the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, that organizes these annual talks. They have interstitial in between meetings that take place, like in June in Bonn, there's an annual meeting. And then there are different working groups that also meet. There's different groups, entities of the United Nations climate negotiations, like the Africa group. This is all UN speak, least developed countries, small island developing states. They have different meetings. I know that the small island developing nations, for example, are going to be meeting in May in the Caribbean. So they meet, but the work related to loss and damage specifically was being discussed as something that should take place in tandem with the World Bank and IMF meetings this spring. And there's been a whole movement that I wrote about last year for the nation around loss and damage in the banking system, where I thought Mia Mottley was doing really great work talking about the whole economic structure that we have coming out of the 1944 Bretton Woods meeting. It gave us the neoliberal architecture that we have today. So for listeners that might not be familiar, nations met in 1944 in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, and they came up with and gave us things that exist to the present day, even if some of them have morphed, like the World Bank, the IMF, the World Trade Organization. So
the New World Order.
Yeah, the New World Order, basically.
Right.
So Mia Mottley, together with a financial advisor, Perso, I'm blanking on his first name right now, we're basically saying, look, a lot of nations in the global South, and she's speaking from her experience being Prime Minister of Barbados, are hit with this double whammy. We have, on the one hand, the financial debt that comes from a combination of colonialism, because whether listeners know it or not, there's a lot of colonized nations, like Haiti is the classic example, had the revolution, and then because of that, to get independence, had to pay France back for lost income that France was no longer going to be able to get from Haiti because it was now independent. It's just such a crazy story right there.
Yeah.
But because of debt incurred through colonialism or imperialism, a lot of nations in the global South, and again, she's speaking from the Caribbean's perspective, are faced, when they have a climate catastrophe, they're faced with this, what I refer to as the double whammy of, do we pay back that debt that in contemporary terms might be World Bank, IMF loans, or do we deal with whatever just hit us with regard to the climate crisis, say a hurricane coming through and its damage? And she was calling for a radical restructuring of the entire loan system so that it took into account these inequities. I thought that was great. I wrote about it for The Nation a year ago. And just a week ago, radio host from LA, who I sometimes, where I sometimes appear to talk about these climate issues, sent me the link to an article written by a colleague whose name I forget at UCLA, but I could quickly find it while we're talking. And he wrote he's also from the Caribbean by heritage. He wrote a very critical article of Mia Mottley's policies. And she alerted me to the fact that this article was making the rounds among Black leftists and wanted to know what I thought about it, if I was aware of it. So I think your listeners should also be aware of the fact that there's criticism of Mia Mottley's policies and maybe to dig deeper.
And where this is playing out, where we're seeing inequity, we're seeing countries which have already been exploited for centuries by, by global north countries, but now they're also being hit with the climate crisis. Is there, there's a lot in your piece about the small island states and people's movements. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the impact that it seems like these voices are being heard a lot more, at least within, maybe it's because I'm also in progressive circles, maybe not in the mainstream, but I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how some of these frontline communities and some of these movements have actually been affecting the possible restructuring of some of these systems.
Thank you so much for that question, Scott. And I'll just cycle back to what I was mentioning previously. The host of it's KPFK's Margaret Prescott, who reached out to me, and she sent me an article that is by Keston Perry, Pery, and it's The Mirage of Mia Motley's Progressive Politics, published in the Black Agenda Report, in case your listeners, viewers want to check that out for more on what I was mentioning. I think the question that you're asking about the centering of frontline communities who are working for, and it really needs to be underscored, the nexus of environmental, racial, and social justice, like the nexus of those issues, are being centered more by the media. I don't think it's the communities that we're located in or the geographic area that we're located in, the Bay Area alone. I think there has been a decided shift. It has come about as a result, I think, in the US of the racial reckoning in the wake of George Floyd, and people at venues that I publish for, The Nation, The Progressive, et cetera, recognizing that they need to think about environmental justice in ways that work to ensure racial and social justice as well. And so what does that mean on the global stage? That means making sure that you really center the voices of frontline communities. I think looking at what happens at the UN climate negotiations, it would be hard not to do that because as a journalist who's been covering them since 2009, I can share with your listeners and viewers what one experiences there as a journalist. If you have almost 200 countries standing up and weighing in one by one, and then as part of these clusters that I've been mentioning, what you come away from these 2 weeks of talks, and when they weigh in, they often reference what is going on in their home countries. So last year it was a third of Pakistan was flooded, $3 billion of damage, about 3,000 people died, half of whom were children. Most of those effects in Pakistan are ongoing to the present day, even though it's over a year later, and they're not in the front lines of the papers. Last year it was the drought in the Horn of Africa. Those effects are ongoing, even if they're not on the front page of the news. So when you go for 2 weeks and you listen to nations weigh in one by one and acknowledge, because it's the respectful thing to do, the situation in their home countries before they weigh in, what you come away from those negotiations with is a visceral sense of what's going on around the world in frontline communities. And then you look at the best papers. I'll just single out The Guardian because they've been doing great coverage of the climate crisis for a very long time, and encouraging us to use language like the climate crisis or the climate emergency. They'll focus on the US-China standoff. And I think the issue, which is totally important to addressing the crisis, but it doesn't center the frontline community's voices. And I think they have been really tenacious. Last year's loss and damage facility being included in the agreement, I really attribute to the tenacious work of, she'd hate being singled out this way because it's not the way of viewing the world and it's too egocentric or individualized. But Tina Gerhardt from the Marshall Islands, lead climate envoy from the Marshall Islands, tiny island nation if you measure it using the land mass, but ginormous if you include all of its maritime territories. Small population of 53,000 people. Your favorite and mine, Kissinger once quipped famously when they were moving people from Bikini Atoll, which yes is where we get the word bikini from, in order for the US to detonate bombs out there. He said, there's only 50,000 people out there. Who gives a damn? So this is the kind of callous disregard that sparsely populated areas get, nations in the Pacific. And yet, I think it was largely Tina Gerhardt's tenacious organizing that she was leading and a huge part of that got this across the finish line. So frontline communities are really important to this conversation, and they are being centered more and more.
One thing I follow a lot of progressive left socialists, although I don't completely identify or agree with everything going on there, but there's been this uptick in conversation about the climate crisis within those circles, and some of that's popular media. We're talking about Jacobin and a lot of big podcasts, but there's been a conversation there about how there needs to be more of a focus on workers and the working class in the U.S. in order to deal with the climate crisis, but they often leave out a conversation about frontline communities, even in the U.S. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on that. It's an interesting, and also I would say those groups, some of those outlets also do a lot of promotion of what I would call false solutions. They're good with nuclear as long as it's owned by the government. They're good with carbon capture as long as it's like being promoted by the government. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I really appreciate it. Look, like the analysis there in the examples you just laid out of the approach to be focused on the state as part of the solution and working together with and ensuring the interests, if one's addressing the climate crisis, of workers is important in that, to go that route first, in that if you're going to look to have a widespread solution rolled out, if you turn the government in that direction and away from the fossil fuels, that's obviously going to have a really positive effect. I could have a long conversation about what I think about nuclears. Being first gen in the US, growing up in a country, Germany, that was staunchly anti-nuclear, and experiencing at close hands what the risks were when Chernobyl exploded in the Ukraine, that's a whole other issue. Is nuclear a solution right now or not? Carbon capture storage, I'll be more explicit about in that it's totally not a solution, and it is being touted by the government. And it's not a solution, and it was part of what was referred to, not explicitly, but in mealy-mouthed UN language in the agreement that came out of COP28. Carbon capture storage is basically capturing carbon or emissions and sequestering them, storing them underground. The reason it doesn't work is that it's prohibitively expensive. It has not been scaled up in order to address the emissions. And so if anyone suggests carbon capture storage, given that it's expensive and hasn't been rolled out, and we're talking about nations in the global south that don't have the budget to roll it out, and that this is the decade when we have to reduce emissions the most. So by 2030, we have to reduce emissions 43%. They have to peak in 2025. I'm looking at my clock and it's almost New Year's, and I'm like, wow, that's a year away that emissions have to peak. Never mind carbon capture storage. The solution is to reduce fossil fuels. And that's where the lack of steps in COP28 is a really big problem. But to bring the discussion, oh, and I haven't lost track of where we started with this, because there's also plenty more that I want to say from the ground up. But I just want to say that bringing the discussion from the global to the national, Biden is the president, as I'm sure you well know, that has signed the most oil and gas leases, or just increased the production of oil and gas, is what I should say, the most of any president.
Including Trump, and only within the last 3 years.
Yes, this is, so there is so much. If we look at COP28 and we're like, what's next? I could say some things as I already did for COP29, but really the what's next from the UN climate negotiations, which don't lead to a legally binding treaty, is that they send a signal as to what we should do at home, meaning in our nations, in our states, in our communities, not viewed in terms of a borders nation state or a state type way. And there's plenty of room. I think liquefied natural gas, which really needs to be renamed as a fossil gas or as something that isn't natural, which sounds so good. I think that's really a front line that we need to work on. And it comes back to your question at the outset, that I think that whole framework that you mentioned at the outset is one framework. I think a really helpful framework for thinking about the solutions is also listening to and engaging the needs of frontline communities in terms of what they want us to push back against and what they want us to work towards. Now, sometimes that might include workers, but if we're talking Indigenous communities, if we're talking Black and Brown communities, I'm waking up in the Bay Area today, as you are, to the news that yesterday investigators descended upon the oil refinery in the East Bay for the incredible, toxic explosion that they have unleashed. So that's terrific, but how about working to shut down that refinery? How about working to shut down LNG and its expansion under President Biden? There have been kayaktivists, as they're called, so activists who are on kayaks up the coast, I know, who have been working to shut down LNG. Germany, a lot of our LNG is going to liquefied natural gas is going from the US to Germany because Germany is trying to wean itself due to the Russia-Ukraine war off of gas that it was previously getting from Russia. So anything we in this country can do to push back against the expansion of LNG that's taking place under Biden is really important work. We can do that nationally, we can do that state, we can do that in our communities. And it definitely helps the global, but also the local.
Yeah, and I'm from the Gulf Coast. I'm from Texas, lived in Houston for a long time, and I always like to point out that a lot of the build out of LNG, liquefied natural gas export facilities, is happening Texas, Louisiana, other parts of the Gulf South. Like I think they're trying to build 3 of them in the Rio Grande Valley alone. And and it goes to one of my other questions related to false solutions is that they talk about transitional fuels in some of the agreement, which is they're talking about natural gas, which is just mostly just a success of propaganda, as far as I'm concerned, to call it natural gas. But and then also the other phrase around the false solutions, which you lifted up, was around unabated coal, which I thought was a very interesting phrasing of that. And that's also related to carbon capture. But there's one of the critiques, I think, of this agreement has been a lot of loopholes. And I see both of those promoting those false solutions as loopholes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, the unabated, boy, sensing to the dictionary, abated means to somehow rein in. So reducing unabated is a reference to coal, which should be reduced if it isn't abated, which means using carbon capture storage, which is a really complicated way of saying, if we have carbon capture storage, does that make that continued use of that fossil fuel okay? I mean, there's 5 or 6, 7, 8 words there that take so much to unpack that the Washington Post had one of its environmental journalists write an entire article about the word abated, unabated. And then I think, the use of natural gas in that sense is, I think that's spot on. It's the kayaktivists were protesting up in the Pacific Northwest, and then it was definitely the LNG terminals that are being set up in Port Arthur, Texas area in Texas, in the Gulf Coast that you were mentioning. They have also had a lot of activist pushback. And I think that needs to continue. We need to look for it. We need to organize against it. And we just need to stop this expansion before it happens and call it out for what it is. It's polluting fossil fuels.
And then my other question from what you said before is how we're supposed to be headed towards peak emissions by 2025. Then another point that you raise, and I actually think in both articles, is about how the fossil fuel sector is moving ahead unabated, and they have all sorts of plans for extraction projects and export projects. And it seems like they have some questions about the COP being in a petro state and some of the forces that were at play there. But I'm just wondering if you could comment a little bit on, it seems like oil and gas anyway is moving full steam ahead in this moment.
Yeah, it definitely is. And there's a number of different ways to read that. And I was just thinking, as you were mentioning natural gas previously, to not forget to mention the reason natural gas is so problematic is because the form of emissions that it emits is methane, which is 5 times more potent than CO2 emissions. To refer to it as natural is really problematic because it's actually even more potent than other forms of fossil fuels, which are differently potent. But there is a bit of a bonanza moment. Barron's published an article. A number of people were tracking this within 24 hours of COP28 agreement being signed. And I wrote about this in one of the 2 articles. There was an unprecedented number of new agreements that were signed. So it was an incredible bonanza. You've mentioned in a previous episode that the head of COP28, Sultan Al Jaber, the president of COP28, is also head of ADNOC, which is the UAE's state oil company. The presence of fossil fuel lobbyists at this year's COP was unprecedented. So this is the largest COP ever. Over 100,000 people registered, about 70,000 people attended, and it had the largest number of fossil fuel lobbyists ever. Kick Big Polluters Out is an organization that was tracking how many fossil fuel lobbyists were there, and according to them, there was 2,500 roughly fossil fuel lobbyists that were in attendance. And that number, the only other numbers that were in that range were possible future host Brazil had a larger number, around 4,000 in attendance. And then current host, the UAE, had roughly that number in attendance. So they were the only ones that had that number. But I think, look, like the read on why is there such a bonanza right now could be read as an indication of the fact that this is the last hurrah of the fossil fuel industry. Here in California today, the news about things coming up in 2024 are the fact that fossil fuel powered leaf blowers, for example, are not going to be possible anymore. I'm reading a novel by friend Chris Carlson right now that is jokingly referring to When Shells Crumble is the title of it, that's looking at a future where there are no more gas-powered cars, for example. And that's actually something that our state, California, post, if I remember correctly, 2035, and I know other states like New York have also implemented. So we're seeing the death knells of the fossil fuel industry. It just needs to happen more quickly.
Yeah, that also made me think of the right wing decrying the war against gas stoves, where
yes, that's the other. Yes,
in California, I think for new houses they have to be electric, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, in California for new construction they have to be electric. That's absolutely right. Yeah, that gets, wow, your rights are really being taken away there. I've seen interesting articles that have acknowledged the ways that both homeowners and crucially renters can actually shift towards electrifying their homes. But again, I think individual actions are great, but let's look at the real big elephants in the room. And you've addressed these on some of your previous programs, but they really bear underscoring. The United States military is the biggest consumer and user of fossil fuels. And so if we demilitarized, that would actually be really helpful for the planet, in addition to obviously dealing with some of the wars that are protracted and ongoing right now, and just unconscionably killing thousands of people around the world as we speak. The largest companies in terms of the use of fossil fuels, the majority of them are US companies. And so if we took action, whether that's legal action, whether that's direct action, working through nonprofits, through legislators, to push back on that kind of a usage, that also has a really radical effect. And I think that's really important as well.
Would you say that the 2 big points that you brought up at the beginning, where we're seeing a lot more conversation about loss and damage, and we're seeing a lot more conversation about fossil fuels and hopefully future phase outs of fossil fuels, could you say a little bit about the impact, all of those? I have a very holistic view of like how we, take on this issue, and everything you just named are ways to do it: lawsuits, legislation, direct action, protest, whatever, targeting corporations, and even like secondary and tertiary corporations. But I'm wondering if you could actually comment on the power of those people-powered movements and those direct action movements to put pressure to move the needle on this. Or is that why we're seeing this sort of shift at the highest levels of world leadership, for example? And why we're also seeing the oil sector and petrostates like UAE like freaking out a little bit, trying to figure out what they can do to do their own version of mitigation against us, for example.
I like that way of referring to it. I think I appreciate the question. I think absolutely that's called at the UN. We often, and I'm sure this gets used in other fora. I share your holistic view of all of the tools in the toolbox, firstly, I should say. And then at UN, we often talk about the inside-outside strategy, which is the fact that people who are outside, who are activists, who don't have the same kind of access to the UN climate negotiations, bring a certain amount of pressure onto the talks, which if those concerns are shared with the climate envoys that are inside, which given that nations from the global south frontline communities definitely do share the concerns, do want to see fossil fuels phased out, that kind of inside-outside strategy definitely has an impact on how the negotiations work. It adds pressure to the voices of the negotiators, the climate envoys that are pushing for similar things. The journalists who are moving between those spaces, they don't have access to all of the negotiating spaces, but they have access to the big briefings that take place inside, as well as the press briefings, but then they also see the activism outside. So when journalists weave all of that together, they can see those kinds of synergies taking place between the activism that's happening outside and the positions of climate envoys on the inside, as well as of certain NGOs that are on the inside. And I think there's absolutely, it's a chorus in some ways, right? There's definitely refrains that are picked up and carried from one venue to another. And it's really important, I think, to recognize that. This is one of the reasons why direct action may not have a direct impact that is palpable, but it's always about those, it's the we are winning versus we won, right? It's always about those indirect impacts that are so important to be aware of, because it is about moving the needle. As you put it, it's about that gradual processual. And that requires keeping the attention on, keeping the focus on, keeping the heat on, keeping the activism on.
Yeah, which also results in most extreme, like different types of backlash, right? Whether it's escalated charges or where they're passing anti-pipeline protest bills in North Dakota, or lawsuits, or in the case of particularly people in the global south, but this also happened in Atlanta around Cop City, the actual murder of environmental defenders and land defenders.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, look, as one of the signs of the last hurrah of the fossil fuel industry, speaking about parting, it's 1999, you can read this bonanza of this rapid explosion of fossil fuel production, but you can also read the mitigation seizing these venues and trying to turn the message on them that you were mentioning a moment ago, but also the amount of backlash. The number of journalists, as you mentioned in the episode just prior to, the number of journalists globally that have been, environmental journalists that have been killed, or the number of environmental activists that have been killed, are disproportionately in the global south, in Mexico, in the Philippines, in Colombia. And that's not just a global issue, but it's also taking place within the US. You mentioned Cop City, which is obviously something where activists are really aware of the nexus among the environmental degradation, right? The mass logging. There's a colleague who is here at UC Berkeley whose aunt lives, he's from Atlanta, and his aunt lives right in that area that is being logged right now. But and he's African American, there's a nexus between environmental degradation, or the demand for environmental justice, and racial and social justice. And I think that's something that movements are really aware of, in environmental justice movements. And I think that's really important to keep the focus on. But I do think that the repression is also increasing. And I'll add to that, eco-fascism is something that I'm increasingly concerned about. Naomi Klein in Doppelganger has a couple of threads running through it about the people who are fasting and doing their clean juices, clean bodies, maintained bodies, and how there's something that's fascistic about all of that, and maintaining the clean gene pool and the clean blood. And there's a way that it runs together with eco-fascism that one can date back to the Nazis, but that rears its head right now in very quirky ways as well. And I just would encourage your listeners, viewers, to be mindful of that as well.
Yeah, there's There's a great podcast out of the UK called 12 Steps for What, I believe, which actually does a lot of covering of the far right. And they've actually done a lot. They actually even published a book on ecofascism, which I definitely encourage people to check that out. We're getting towards the end of our time, and I probably have two more questions. One is, it seems what we've been talking about here is a shift in COP and at least language that they're using, and hopefully progress that they're making, definitely since 1992 in Rio. And I'm just wondering where you think we can expect to go. We've talked about a lot of things here. We can talk about backlash of the state, the oil sector, or whatever. But I'm just wondering where you see some of this going in the next couple of years.
I think nations that are frontline communities, I know this from my work with and on engaging the struggles of Pacific Islanders with regard to sea level rise. You mentioned my book, Sea Change, which really deals with sea level rise and its impact on island communities. So I know from having interviewed people specifically in the Marshall Islands that to some extent they have stopped expecting, hoping, wishing, demanding that the global north actually take action because they've been doing it for 30 years and nothing is happening. And that's a lot of what Sea Change is about. They are also, to avoid narratives of white saviorism, they are already taking actions to address the climate crisis that we in the global north have created. And so I expect to see that kind of work in frontline communities continue. But I think I fully expect that the combination of environmental, racial, social justice movements in the US will continue to work in an intersectional way, and that it will also continue to work to reduce the expansion of the fossil fuel industry here in the US because we are the source of the problem, right? That's the kind of thing that I can see happening. And almost regardless of where, people focus on electoral politics so much, almost regardless of what happens next year with regard to electoral politics, because of what we were saying previously about Biden. So it doesn't really matter if Trump or if Biden is in office with regard to specifically the expansion of fossil fuels. And so that work I expect to see unabated. It's unabated, What I think is,
I found myself using that word a lot more after I read your article.
That's hopefully we don't get too much language from the UN permeating our speak. Otherwise, we'll need translators. But I would say that this focus on fossil fuels and on the climate, on the payments, are going to continue to be the focus at the international level. Nationally, the pushback against fossil fuels, I think, is going to continue.
And then my last question, and this is because this is also one of an issue area we cover a lot, which is around foreign policy and issues of war and conflict. And I saw images from COP28 of people in solidarity with Palestinians and what's going on in Gaza. I'm wondering if you could actually talk a little bit about overlap that you may be picking up on between some climate issues and issues, particularly around Gaza and Israel, but anything around war and peace, because we also talk about actually the war in Ukraine a lot on this show. And then to me, it also seems like there have been some difficulty in connecting dots between being a movement in international solidarity with other people in the world and climate and other things going on domestically in the US.
Yeah, thank you for that. One thing that I'll say that strikes me, and that I've seen a lot of different people comment on, is the fact that we in the US seem to have no end of funds for all sorts of wars, because this is a war that the US and US taxpayers are obviously paying for, referring specifically to both, but specifically to more recently, the Israeli attack on Palestine. I have a hard time using the word war there because that seems to indicate two nation states that are using their militaries against one another. And this is not that situation. And attack on, or something that gets at the inequity, always seems more appropriate there. So I find it somewhat confusing, to be really ridiculously diplomatic and mealy-mouthed about it, that we have funds for these kinds of ventures when there is not enough funding for all sorts of other things, whether those are environment or the nexus of environmental, racial, social justice. And that's part of the Cop City argument as well. In Atlanta, not to confuse our cops, is why do we have all the money to expand this kind of an entity when the funds could be used, are needed for things X, Y, and Z? And it brings us kind of full circle back to what we were talking about previously, which is that if we were to rein in military budgets, and first and foremost, the US military budget, it would go such a long way to dealing with the climate crisis, but also with regard to environmental racial justice. Look, I have a full-on paragraph in my book about all of the different islands that are used globally for the US military to park itself around the world. And I kept taking it out, and then I kept putting it in. I took it out because I was like, there's no argument. It's just a list. And any good editor will say, a list is not an argument. But I left it in because I'm not sure everyone recognizes how much our military impacts, not just in terms of the places we attack, but the places where we park ourselves and the places we colonize in order to have a home for a US military infrastructure so that we're closer to whatever's going on in that area. And that has all sorts of impacts. I teach at the University of Hawaii, and islands real estate and food and energy costs this is true for Hawaii, this is true for Puerto Rico, Marshall Islands, their costs are all driven up by the presence of the US military. So and then obviously it's a racial and social justice concern for the local communities that are there. But I think the war is tied, these wars, these attacks are tied in these different kinds of ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we just actually did an interview with Brandon Lee, who was a activist in the Philippines who had been working with indigenous communities, land defenders on environmental issues, and he had basically been shot by the Philippine government military and left a quadriplegic, and it's all funded by the U.S. He often says that the bullets lodged in his body are paid for by the U.S. taxpayers. Paid for by the U.S. taxpayers, yeah.
Yeah, I listen, it's a terrible story, and I think we should think about that line of relationship. We should absolutely think about it. So another way of putting that is, if that's not what we want to see happen, then what action are we taking in order to avert that, in order to turn that, right? And I think that's absolutely an important question to ask, because these are related.
Yep, absolutely. I'm gonna wrap it there because I actually think that's a good point to end it on. Folks, we've been talking with Tina Gerhardt, who is an environmental justice who covers the UN climate change negotiations, climate change or the climate crisis, sea level rise, with a focus on environmental justice. You can find her writing in Grist, The Nation, The Guardian, Orion, and Sierra Magazine. And then she's also the author of Sea Change, an Atlas of Islands in a Rising Ocean. And for folks who enjoy this show, please check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you're watching this on YouTube, hit the subscribe button. If you're listening to us on one of the many audio platforms that we're on, please give us a rate and review. And if you really like us, particularly since it's the end of the year, become a patron at patreon.com/greenredpodcast, or go to our website and make a one-time donation by hitting that support button. And then we have some nifty swag. We have some nifty green and red swag. This hat I'm wearing is one of them. If you want to donate $25, which includes shipping, we will send you a hat. Just email us at greenredpodcast@gmail.com. And Tina, it's been great talking to you. Thank you for joining me today.
It's been great talking to you, Scott. Thanks.
Yep. And everyone else, go out and misbehave, and we'll talk to you again soon.